Hello, so in this recording I'm focusing on inflation and CPI. CPI is Consumer Prices Index. So first of all, this is the definition of inflation. So it's a general rise in the level of prices throughout the economy. So this might be things like a rise in house prices, it might be a rise in food prices or clothing prices. Okay, and we'll come on to how they might measure that in a moment. But yeah, you're looking at a general rise in level of prices throughout the economy. And this is typically as a response to rising aggregate demand. So if the population as a whole increases demand for particular products, then the firms will raise prices accordingly, because there is that relationship between demand and price. And deflation, on the other hand, is falling price levels. So we want to try to measure inflation because governments try to manage this, because you might have heard in the news about countries which occasionally have really rapidly rising inflation. One of the problems there is, people's take-home pay suddenly becomes worth a lot less if you've got very, very high levels of inflation, and people can't afford to buy things, very rapidly. Prices really do rise. So governments are interested in how fast prices are rising, and there's a survey called the Household Expenditure Survey, which has a defined common basket of goods and services. So it packages together a group of goods and services that people routinely buy, and it uses this as the measure. And this is where we get this price of a basket of goods. And what's happened is, over the years, this has been developed as a price index, and then governments can compare year on year, month on month against a base year, so they can look at the way inflation is changing, and then they can take appropriate action to try to manage this inflation. And one of the things that governments want to do is to try to keep the inflation relatively low. So one of the ways we measure this is through this Consumer Prices Index, the CPI. And there is also a Consumer Price Index housing, which actually includes as well costs related to home ownership and council tax. Now, these are all measured and documented in national statistics. You will also see mentioned, particularly in news items, the Retail Price Index, which is RPI or RPIX. This is actually not a national statistics, but is also another way of measuring inflation, but it's not the standard indices that governments will use. And then there are three types of inflation. So first of all, the main one is this demand pull one. So where there is this increased aggregate demand leads to higher inflation. So lots of people start demanding more particular products and services, their prices will rise. But there's also cost push, and this is where increased cost leads to inflation. So a classic one is often oil prices, and you probably think, well, what's oil prices got to do with event management? But because oil prices tend to underpin costs of things like transportation, heating, energy supply, they tend to, if oil prices rise, they tend to put up costs of other things. So for instance, if you're organising a live event, there might be transport to get to the event, there might be transporting goods, facilities there. It puts all those costs up. And certainly oil prices have had quite a big impact on, for instance, business events, not necessarily through inflation, but what they've done is they've put up the cost of travel in the past when oil prices were high, and that's deterred actually companies sending people on business travel because of that. So it's a slightly different issue, but you can see that oil prices can be quite significant within the context of events. But obviously there can be other things that lead to costs and cause inflation. For instance, at the moment, I don't think we're seeing it yet, but because of COVID-19, there can be increased costs because, for instance, maybe you need to put in more safety measures, more risk sort of related measures, more security if you're trying to run live events, and then that has extra costs associated with it. And then there's inflationary expectations. So when inflation is expected, what typically happens is the demand for wage increases, and this pushes up costs, so then you get the cost push inflation and leads to further inflation. So these are all things that happening in the economy, and the government seeks to try to manage these.